The night was not just dark, it was oppressive. A heavy blanket of charcoal clouds that seemed to press down upon the Louisiana landscape with suffocating weight. It was one of those torrential downpours that the locals whispered about, the kind of storm that washed away the topsoil and turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud. The thunder didn't just rumble, it cracked like a whip, shaking the very foundations of the earth, while lightning fractured the sky in jagged veins of electric blue. Robert Vance gripped the steering wheel of the black Chevrolet Suburban, his knuckles white against the leather. The windshield wipers were fighting a losing battle, slapping back and forth at a frantic pace, barely clearing the sheet of rain that poured down like a waterfall. Beside him, his wife, Susan, held on to the handle above the door, her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead, where the headlights struggled to penetrate the gloom. In the back seat, their two daughters, Jessica and Emily, were huddled together under a blanket, the younger one, Emily, asleep against the window, while 16-year-old Jessica stared out into the void, her face illuminated intermittently by the flashes of lightning. "We should have waited in New Orleans until morning," Susan said, her voice trembling slightly, barely audible over the roar of the rain and the hum of the engine. "Robert, this isn't safe. The GPS lost signal 10 miles back." Robert sighed, adjusting his glasses, which were fogging up despite the defroster blowing at full blast. "We don't have a choice, Sue. The transfer orders were explicit. I need to be at the regional office by Monday morning. This lodge is the only government housing available in the district. We can't stay in a motel forever." "But look at this weather," Susan insisted, glancing at the murky water rising along the sides of the road. "The bayou is swelling. If the levees break—" "They won't," said Robert, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "It's just a little rain. We're almost there. The coordinates said the lodge should be just past this bend." The car lurched as a tire hit a deep pothole hidden beneath the water. The suspension groaned in protest. They were deep in the heart of Bayou Noir, a remote parish in Louisiana known for its dense cypress forests, winding waterways, and isolation. It was a place where civilization felt thin, where the modern world faded into the moss-draped trees and the slow, dark flow of the water. Robert had been transferred from Chicago to oversee the Environmental Compliance Division for the region, a promotion that came with a hefty paycheck, but also required moving his family to this godforsaken corner of the country. Suddenly, the headlights caught something ahead. A structure emerged from the rain like a ghost ship. A small, weathered wooden house sitting precariously on stilts near the edge of the road. Parked in front of it was their destination marker, but blocking the driveway was another vehicle, an old, rusted pickup truck that looked like it had seen better decades ago. "Is that it?" Jessica asked from the back, waking her sister. "That's the caretaker's place," Robert said, slowing the SUV to a crawl. The engine ticked as it cooled, the sound swallowed by the relentless drumming of the rain. Robert turned off the headlights, plunging them in momentary darkness before switching on the interior dome light. "Stay here. I'll go knock." "No," Susan said, unbuckling her seatbelt. "I'm not staying in this car alone while you walk into the storm." Robert nodded, understanding her fear. They stepped out into the deluge. The rain was cold, soaking through their jackets instantly. Robert pulled his collar up and marched toward the porch, his dress shoes sinking into the mud. He reached the door and knocked heavily, the sound echoing strangely against the wood. There was no answer immediately, just the sound of the wind howling through the cypress trees. Then the door creaked open. Standing there was an old man, thin as a rail, with skin that looked like a worn map of the region. His face was deeply lined, etched by years of sun and wind, and his eyes were a pale, watery blue that seemed to see right through you. He wore a faded flannel shirt and suspenders, holding a kerosene lantern that cast dancing shadows on his face. This was Silas, the caretaker. "You're the Vance family," Silas said. His voice was raspy, like dry leaves scraping together. He didn't shout, yet his voice cut through the storm clearly. "Yes, I'm Robert Vance, the new regional director," Robert said, extending a hand. Silas didn't take it. He just stared. "We got the notice," Silas said, turning back into the house. "Come in. Don't let the spirits in with you." Susan froze for a second. "Spirits?" Robert whispered. "Just local superstition," Robert muttered, ushering the family inside. The interior of the caretaker's house was sparse but clean. The air smelled of dried herbs and gold wood. Silas moved to a small table and picked up a heavy iron key. "Here," Silas said, handing it to Robert. "The lodge is about 2 miles up the road. You can't miss it. It's the only big house on the water." "Thank you," Robert said, taking the key. "We appreciate you staying up to meet us. I know it's late." The clock on the wall was past midnight. Late is when the sun goes down. Now is just dark. He looked at Jessica and Emily. "You have girls." "Shh," Susan said, protective instinct kicking in. "They're tired." "The water is high tonight," Silas said, ignoring her comment. "The bayou is swelling. You stay away from the edge, especially at night." "We'll be careful," Robert said, trying to keep the tone light. "Is the lodge ready? Electricity? Water?" "Ready as it can be," Silas said. "Generators full, but the phone lines, they go in and out with the storm. You're on your own out there." "We're used to independence," Robert said. "Thanks again, Silas. We'll see you in the morning." Silas didn't move. He stood by the door, watching them leave. "Creepy guy," Jessica muttered from the back. "He's lived here a long time, Jess. People get particular," Robert said, putting the car into drive. They pulled away from the caretaker's house, the tires splashing through the deepening puddles. The road narrowed, flanked by both sides by dense vegetation. Spanish moss hung from the trees like gray beards, swaying in the wind. The headlights reflected off the water that had breached the banks, turning the road into a shallow
said,
canal.
pointing to the left. "Is that the river?" "That's the Bayou," Robert corrected. "It connects to the Atchafalaya Basin. It's everywhere out here." As they drove, the storm seemed to intensify. A particularly loud clap of thunder made Emily cry out in her sleep. Susan reached back to comfort her. "I don't like this," Susan said. "Silas said not to take the levee road, but the GPS was showing a shortcut." "Forget the GPS," Robert said firmly. "We follow the caretaker's instructions. He knows the land." They drove in silence for another 20 minutes. The road wound along the edge of the water. On their right, the dark expanse of the bayou stretched out, invisible except for the white caps created by the wind. On their left, the trees loomed like sentinels. Suddenly, Robert slammed on the brakes. "What is it?" Susan gasped. "Look," Robert said, pointing ahead. Standing on the side of the road, just ahead of where the path diverged, was a figure. It was Silas. He was standing there without an umbrella, soaked to the bone, holding his lantern. "That's impossible," Robert whispered. "We left him at his house. We haven't passed anyone else." "Maybe he took another car," Susan suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "No, there's no other vehicle. And look, he's walking toward the lodge path, the one he told us not to take." As they watched, Silas turned off the main road and stepped onto a narrow, muddy track that led directly toward the water's edge. He disappeared into the darkness between the trees. "Did you see that, Jessica?" asked one of the children, leaning forward between the front seats. "He just walked into the swamp." "He knows what he's doing," Robert said, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Let's keep moving. We're almost there." They drove on, the tension in the car palpable. 10 minutes later, the trees parted, and there it was, the Government Lodge. It was a large Victorian-style structure painted a fading white, raised on high pilings to protect it from floods. It looked imposing and lonely against the black sky. A single light burned on the porch. Robert pulled the SUV into the gravel driveway. The engine died, and the silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rain. "We're here," Robert said, letting out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. The family hurried from the car to the porch, shielding their faces from the wind. Robert fitted the heavy iron key into the lock. It turned with a grinding sound, the mechanism rusty from disuse. He pushed the door open. The air inside was stale, smelling of dust and closed-up rooms. Robert fumbled for the light switch near the entrance. With a flick, the chandelier in the foyer buzzed to life, casting a warm yellow glow over the wooden floorboards. Okay, let's get settled, Robert said, trying to sound cheerful. Susan, you and the girls take the upstairs bedrooms. I'll take the master on the ground floor. We'll unpack in the morning. The house was spacious, furnished with heavy antique furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. Thick rugs covered the floors and dark curtains hung over the windows. It felt solid, safe, but there was an underlying stillness to the place, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Susan walked to the large window in the living room. She pulled back the curtain. Outside the bayou was a churning mass of black water. The rain had eased slightly, but the wind was still picking up the waves, slamming them against the pilings of the house. "Robert," Susan called out, "come look at this view." Robert joined her. From this angle, they could see the water lapping just a few yards from the edge of the property. The lodge was built closer to the water than he had expected. "It's beautiful," Jessica said, coming up behind them, in a scary way. "It is isolated," Robert admitted, "but it's secure, and it's ours for the next 2 years." Silas appeared at the door again. They hadn't heard him approach. He stood on the threshold, water dripping from his hat onto the floor. "I brought some extra candles," Silas said, holding up a box. "Power might cut. Generator is old." "Thank you, Silas," Robert said, taking the box. "You really didn't have to come back out in this." "House needs watching," Silas said. He stepped inside, looking around the room with critical eyes. "Previous tenants, they didn't last long." "Why is that?" Susan asked, her curiosity piqued despite her fatigue. "Water gets in," Silas said vaguely. "Mind gets out." Robert exchanged a glance with Susan. "Well, we're sturdy folks. We'll be fine." Silas walked to the window, looking out at the dark water. "You hear things out here. The wind and the cypress, the water moving. Sometimes, other things." "Like what?" Jessica asked, her teenage skepticism warring with a growing sense of unease. "Voices," Silas said, turning to look at her. His pale eyes locked on hers. "Don't go down to the water. Not at night. Not when the moon is hidden. The bayou takes what it wants." "We heard you the first time," Robert said, his patience wearing thin. "We won't go near the water. We're just here to sleep." "Sleep light," Silas said. He turned to leave. "I'll be in the caretaker's cabin, 2 miles back. Don't call unless it's life or death. Phone lines won't work anyway." "Wait," Susan said. "Where are the supplies? The grocery store?" "Town is 20 miles east. Road floods sometimes. Stock up when you can." With that, Silas stepped out into the night and vanished into the rain. Robert locked the door behind him and engaged the deadbolt. "All right, that's enough for tonight. Let's get to sleep." The family dispersed to their rooms. The house creaked as the wind buffeted it. Upstairs, Jessica and Emily shared a room with 2 twin beds. The window in their room faced the water. Emily was too tired to care. She changed into her pajamas, climbed into bed, asleep within minutes. Jessica, however, couldn't settle. She walked to the window and looked out. The rain had stopped, leaving a thick mist hovering over the water. The moon was beginning to break through the clouds, casting a silvery path across the bayou. It was eerily quiet now. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that felt washed clean, but somehow wrong. Jessica pressed her hand against the glass. She could see the mud bank below, exposed by the low tide. It looked slippery and dark. "Don't go down to the water," Silas's voice echoed in her mind. "Why?" she whispered to herself. "It's just water." She turned away from the window and climbed into bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house sounded like a footstep. Every rustle of the trees
Susan were in the master bedroom. Robert was reviewing files on his tablet, the blue light illuminating his face. "You think we made a mistake?" Susan asked, lying in bed beside him. "About taking the job?" Robert didn't look up. "No, it's a great opportunity. The pay is double what I was making in Chicago. We can save for the girls' college." "Not the job," Susan said softly. "Moving here. This place, it feels heavy." Robert put the tablet down. "It's just old, Sue, and the weather is intense. We're from the city. This is culture shock. Give it a week." "Silas," Susan said. "Did you see his eyes? He looked frightened." "Silas is a local. He believes in swamp monsters and voodoo. We're rational people. We don't need to worry about superstitions." Robert reached over and turned off the lamp. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we unpack." But in the darkness, neither of them slept well.
The house settled around them, groaning like a living thing. Morning came with a gray, overcast sky. The storm had passed, leaving the air humid and thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying vegetation. Robert was the first to wake. He stretched, feeling the stiffness in his back from the unfamiliar bed. He walked to the kitchen to start coffee. As he walked toward the back door, he noticed something on the floor. Mud. Dark, wet mud tracked across the pristine wooden floorboards of the kitchen. "What the?" Robert muttered. He followed the trail. It led from the back door across the kitchen and then stopped. There were no tracks leading out, only tracks leading in. "Susan!" Robert called out. Susan came down the stairs, tying her robe. "What is it?" "Look at the floor," Robert said, pointing. "Someone came in last night." Susan's face went pale. "The locks? Did you check the locks?" Robert rushed to the back door. The deadbolt was engaged. The front door was locked. The windows were all shut. "They're all locked. Nothing was forced." "Then how did the mud get here?" Susan whispered. Jessica and Emily came down the stairs, rubbing their eyes. "What's going on?" Jessica asked. "Stay upstairs," Robert commanded, his voice sharp. "Go back to your room." "No," Jessica said, seeing the mud. "What is that?" "Someone tracked mud in, but I don't know how." He opened the back door and stepped out onto the porch. The wooden deck was wet with dew. He looked down toward the ground below the pilings. The mud was soft there. He walked down the stairs to the ground. The mud near the house was churned up, and there, leading away from the house and toward the water, were footprints. But something was wrong. Robert crouched down. The toes of the prints were pointing toward the house, but the heel marks were deeper toward the water. "Susan, come look at this," Robert called. Susan came out onto the porch, holding her robe tight around her. "What am I looking at?" "The footprints," Robert said. "They're walking backwards, or coming out of the water." Susan looked down. He was right. The impressions in the mud showed that whatever made them had stepped out of the bayou, walked up to the house, and then vanished? No, the tracks inside the house only went one way, into the kitchen. "This isn't funny, Robert," Susan said, her voice shaking. "Who came into our house?" "I don't know," Robert said, standing up and wiping his hands on his pants. Maybe the house settled? Maybe the mud cracked." "Mud doesn't walk into the kitchen, Robert," Susan snapped. Jessica came down the stairs and out onto the porch. She looked at the ground. "Those aren't adult footprints," she said quietly. Robert looked again. She was right. The prints were small. Size 6, maybe. A child's foot. "Emily," Susan grabbed her younger daughter's hand. "You didn't come out here, did you?" "No, Mom," Emily said, looking scared. "I was asleep." "Jessica?" Robert looked at his older daughter. "No, Dad, I swear." Jessica was staring at the water. The bayou was calm now, a sheet of glass reflecting the gray sky. "Silas said not to go near the water." "Silas knows nothing," Robert said, though he felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. "I'm going to drive over to his cabin. I need to ask him about this. Maybe some local kids were messing around." "Don't go alone," Susan said. "I'll be fine. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." Robert got into the SUV and drove back down the road toward the caretaker's house. The mud was thick and the car slid slightly, but he made it. The cabin was empty. The door was unlocked. Inside, the lantern was cold. Silas was gone. Robert returned to the lodge 20 minutes later, unsettled. He didn't tell Susan everything. He just said Silas wasn't home. "We'll be careful," Robert said at lunch. "I'll check the locks every night. Maybe we should install a security system." "Who's going to install it out here?" Susan asked, pouring iced tea. "We're on our own, Robert. Just admit it." The day passed slowly. The humidity was oppressive. The girls helped Susan unpack boxes in the living room. They tried to act normal, but the mystery of the footprints hung over them like a cloud. Jessica found herself drawn to the window again. She watched the water. It looked so inviting, cool and dark. "Jess, pass me that box," Susan said. Jessica turned away from the window. "Sorry, Mom." That evening, they ordered pizza from the only place that delivered to the parish. It arrived cold, but they ate it in silence. The tension was palpable.
Robert checked the locks 3 times before bed. "Everything is secure," he announced. "No one is getting in." But as they lay in bed, Jessica listened. She heard the water lapping against the pilings. Slap, slap, slap. It sounded like footsteps. The next day, the sun was shining, though the air remained thick and sticky. The storm seemed like a distant memory, but the mud around the house was still wet. "We need groceries," Susan said, looking at the empty fridge. "Robert, you have that meeting at the office today, right?" "Yes, in New Iberia. I'll be gone most of the day. Can you manage?" "I'll take the girls. We'll drive to the town, get some fresh air." "Be back by dark," Robert said, kissing her on the cheek, "and stay away from the water."
Loaded into
"We
the
will,"
SUV.
Susan promised.
Jessica sat in the back, looking out the window as they drove away from the lodge. As they passed the bend in the road where they had seen Silas the first night, Jessica saw something. "Stop!" Jessica yelled. "What?" Susan slammed on the brakes. "Back there!" Jessica pointed. "By the trees!" Susan looked. There was nothing but cypress trees and mud. "There's nothing there, Jess." "I saw a girl," Jessica said. "She was waving at me." "Probably a local kid," Susan said, putting the car back in drive. "Don't lean out the window." They reached the small town of Bayou Noir. It was a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a general store and a gas station. People stared as they drove by. The Vance family stuck out like sore thumbs. City clothes, clean car, nervous energy. Susan parked in front of the general store. "Okay, girls, stay together. We get what we need and we leave." They walked inside. The store smelled of bait, coffee, and old wood. The cashier, a heavy-set man with a beard, nodded at them but didn't speak. Susan grabbed a basket. "Jessica, go get some fish. The man at the counter said they have fresh catch from the bayou." "Fish?" Jessica wrinkled her nose. "Can't we get chicken?" "Your father likes fish, and it's local. Go on." Jessica walked to the back of the store where the ice chest was. Inside lay several large catfish, their eyes cloudy, scales slick. She reached in to grab one. As her hand touched the cold fish, she heard a voice. "You come back." Jessica spun around. No one was there, just the aisles of canned goods. "Hello?" she called out. Silence. She shook her head. "Stop it, Jessica. You're imagining things." She grabbed the fish and took it to the counter. Susan paid, and they loaded the bags into the car. On the drive back, Jessica was quiet. She kept looking at the side of the road. "Are you okay?" Emily asked. "Yeah," Jessica lied. "Just tired." As they approached the lodge, the road narrowed again. The trees closed in. Jessica saw her again. Standing on the side of the road near the water's edge was a girl. She looked about Jessica's age. She wore a white dress that looked old-fashioned, like something from a painting. Her hair was long and black, hanging down her back. She was barefoot. "Mom, stop!" Jessica shouted. "Not again, Jessica," Susan said, exasperated. "No, look! She's there!" Susan slowed down. She looked. "I don't see anyone, Jess. There's no one there." "She's waving," Jessica pointed. "She wants me to play." "There is no one." Susan's voice was sharp now. "Stop making things up. It's not funny." Jessica looked back. The girl was still there. She smiled. It was a sad smile. Then she pointed toward the water. When they got home, Jessica ran to her room. She couldn't shake the image of the girl. The white dress, the bare feet, the way she seemed to appear and disappear. That evening, Robert returned from his meeting. He was tired and irritable. "How is town?" he asked, loosening his tie. "Fine," Susan said quickly. She didn't want to tell him about Jessica's hallucinations. "We got food." "Good. I'm going to take a shower." After dinner, Jessica asked to go for a walk. "No," Robert said firmly. "Not outside, not after dark." "Just on the porch," Jessica pleaded. "I need air." "Fine. Porch only, door stays open." Jessica went out onto the porch. The night was warm. The cicadas were singing loudly, a rhythmic chirping that filled the darkness. She looked out at the water. The moon was full tonight, casting a bright path across the bayou. She saw her again. This time, the girl was closer. She was standing on the mud bank, just below the pilings of the house. She looked up at Jessica. "Who are you?" Jessica whispered. The girl didn't speak. She just held out her hand. In her hand was a small silver fish.
come, the voice whispered. It wasn't coming from the girl's mouth. It was coming from the wind, from the water, from inside Jessica's head. I can't, Jessica said. My dad said no. Hungry, the voice said. Always hungry. The girl dropped the fish. It landed in the mud with a soft splash. Then she turned and walked into the water. She didn't swim. She just walked, sinking deeper until the water covered her head. She didn't resurface. Jessica rubbed her eyes. When she looked again, the bank was empty. Jess? Robert's voice came from the doorway. Come inside, now. Jessica hurried inside. Did you see her? She asked. Who? Robert locked the door. The girl in the water. Robert sighed. Jessica, we need to talk about this. You're stressed. The move, the new school, it's a lot, but you need to stop seeing things that aren't there. I saw her, Dad. She walked into the water. Enough, Robert said. Go to bed. Jessica went to her room, but she didn't sleep. She lay there listening to the water. It sounded like whispering. The next day, Robert had to go to the office again. Susan decided to stay home and organize the kitchen. Jessica, Susan said, I need you to run an errand for me. Where? Jessica asked. The store. I forgot to get dessert and some more bait for your father's fishing trip this weekend. Can Emily come? No, she has homework. You take the car. Be careful. Jessica took the keys. She was nervous about driving alone, but she needed to get out of the house. She needed to know if the girl was real. She drove the SUV down the road. The sun was high, burning off the mist. The bayou looked peaceful, almost beautiful. She reached the store, bought the items, and started back.
The one Silas had warned them about. She told herself it was just to save time, but deep down, she wanted to see the spot where she had seen the girl. She turned the car onto the muddy track. The tire slipped, but she kept going. She stopped near the spot. She got out of the car. The air was still. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, just silence. Hello? She called out. Nothing. She walked toward the water. The mud was soft under her sneakers. She reached the edge. The water was dark, opaque. You came, the voice said. Jessica spun around. The girl was standing right behind her. Up close, she was even more beautiful, but there was something wrong with her skin. It was pale, almost translucent. Her eyes were completely black. Who are you? Jessica asked, her voice trembling. I am the one who waits, the girl said. Her voice sounded like water flowing over stones. You smell like the land, dry, hard. I need to go, Jessica said, backing away. Stay, the girl said. She reached out and touched Jessica's arm. Her hand was ice cold. Play with me. Catch fish. Eat. I have to go home. Home is dry. Water is forever. Jessica pulled her arm away. No! She turned and ran back to the car. She didn't look back. She threw the car into reverse and sped away, tires spinning in the mud until they caught traction. She drove fast, her heart pounding in her chest. As she approached the lodge, the sky began to darken again. Clouds were gathering quickly, unnaturally fast. She parked the car and ran to the porch. She had the bag of groceries. Inside the bag, wrapped in paper, was the fish she had bought, but it felt different, heavier. She opened the door. The house was dark. The power was out. Mom? Jessica called out. In the kitchen, Susan's voice came. Jessica walked to the kitchen. Susan was lighting candles. You took too long, Susan said. The storm is coming back. I know, Jessica said. She put the bag on the table. Mom, I saw her again. Susan stopped lighting the candle. Jessica, please. She touched me, Jessica said. She held up her arm. There was a bruise there, a handprint, cold and blue. Susan gasped. What is that? I don't know, Jessica felt. Doozy, I smell something. Smell what? Rotting fish, Jessica said. It's strong. Susan sniffed the air. I don't smell anything, just the storm. Jessica opened the bag of groceries. She took out the fish she had bought at the store. It was wrapped in newspaper. She unwrapped it. It wasn't the catfish she had bought. It was a different kind of fish, small, silver, with sharp teeth, and it was raw,
bleeding. "I didn't buy this," Jessica whispered. "Where did that come from?" Susan asked, stepping back. "It was in the bag," Jessica said. She looked at her hands. They were wet, slimy. "Mom, my hands!" "Go wash them," Susan said, her voice rising in panic. "Go to the sink." Jessica went to the sink. She turned on the tap. No water. The pump was off. "It's not working," Jessica said. She looked at the fish in her hand. She felt a sudden, overwhelming hunger, not for bread or meat, for the fish, raw. "Jessica, put that down," Susan commanded. "I'm hungry," Jessica said. Her voice sounded different, deeper. "Jessica!" Jessica took a bite. The crunch of bones echoed in the quiet kitchen. Blood dripped down her chin. Susan screamed, "Robert! Robert!" Jessica didn't stop. She ate the fish quickly, greedily. When she was done, she licked her fingers. She looked at her mother. Her eyes were dark, too dark. "Who are you?" Susan whispered, backing against the counter. Jessica smiled. It wasn't Jessica's smile. It was the girl's smile. Sad, hungry. "We are hungry." But the voice wasn't hers. Robert rushed home as soon as he got the call. The storm had broken again, rain lashing against the windshield. He skidded into the driveway and ran into the house. "Susan! Jessica!" he shouted. He found them in the kitchen. Susan was huddled in the corner, trembling. Jessica was standing by the table, her face smeared with blood. "What happened?" Robert demanded, rushing to his wife. She ate it," Susan sobbed. "Raw, and she's not herself." Robert looked at Jessica. "Jessica? Honey, what's wrong?" Jessica turned to him. "Daddy," she said, "the water is rising." "Let's get you cleaned up," Robert said, reaching for her. Jessica slapped his hand away. Her strength was surprising. "Don't touch. You are dry." "Jessica, stop this," Robert said firmly. "We are going to the hospital." "No hospital," Jessica said. "The Bayou keeps us." Robert grabbed her arm. She struggled, thrashing like a wild animal. "Susan, call 911. "The phones are dead, Robert," Susan cried. Robert managed to subdue Jessica. She was incredibly strong, her body rigid. He dragged her toward the living room. "Let me go," Jessica screamed, but the voice was layered, like two voices speaking at once. "Let me go to her." "Who?" Robert demanded. "The girl. She is waiting." Robert tied Jessica to a chair with a rope from the garage. She stopped struggling once she was bound. She sat there, staring at the window. "We need to leave," Robert said. "Now, pack the car." "We can't leave her like this," Susan said. "We have to. Something is wrong with this place, with the water." They rushed to pack bags. Thunder shook the house. When they came back into the living room, the chair was empty. The rope was cut, cleanly. "Jessica!" Robert yelled. He ran to the back door. It was open. The rain,
Susan whimpered. They ran out onto the porch. The beam of Robert's flashlight cut through the rain. They saw her. Jessica was walking toward the water. She wasn't running. She was walking calmly, like she was being pulled by a string. "Jessica, stop!" Robert shouted. He ran after her. The mud sucked at his shoes. Jessica reached the edge of the bank. She turned to look at her father. Her face was calm, serene. "I have to go," she said. "She promised me forever." "Jessica, no!" Robert lunged for her, but the ground beneath him gave way. The bank had eroded. He slipped, falling to his knees in the mud. Jessica stepped into the water. It didn't splash. It seemed to accept her. She walked deeper, waist high, chest high. "Come back!" Susan screamed from the porch. Jessica looked back one last time. "Don't be sad. The water is warm." She sank beneath the surface. Robert scrambled to the edge. He plunged his hand into the water. "Jessica!" Nothing. No bubbles, no struggle. Just the dark, silent bayou. "She's gone," Susan whispered, collapsing onto the wet grass. Robert stayed there for hours, kneeling in the mud, searching for something that wasn't there. The rain washed over them, cold and indifferent. Epilogue: The Caretaker. They left Bayou Noir 3 days later. Robert requested an immediate transfer. He didn't
care about the promotion, he didn't care about the money. They drove away in silence. The lodge stood empty behind them, watching them go. As they passed the caretaker's cabin, Robert stopped the car. Silas was standing on the porch. He wasn't surprised to see them. "She went to the water," Robert said, his voice hollow. He rolled down the window. Silas nodded slowly. "The bayou takes what it wants. Sometimes it takes a child. Sometimes it takes a soul." "Why didn't you tell us?" Robert asked, anger flaring in his chest. "Why didn't you warn us properly?" "I did. I told you not to go near the water. I told you the footprints were wrong. You didn't listen. The land speaks. You only heard the noise." "Can we get her back?" asked Susan from the back seat. Her eyes were red and swollen. Silas looked at her with pity. "The water doesn't give back, ma'am. Not whole. Sometimes you see them in the mist, but they aren't the same." Robert put the car in gear. "Come with us," he said suddenly. "Leave this place." "This is my place," Silas said. "Someone has to watch the lodge. Someone has to warn the next ones." Robert drove away. He didn't look back. Months later in Chicago, Jessica's room was kept exactly as she left it. Susan would go in sometimes and sit on the bed. She swore she could smell the bayou, the wet earth, the rotting fish. One night, Susan woke up to the sound of water, dripping. She went to the bathroom. The tap was running. She turned it off, but the sound continued. It was coming from the hallway. She walked out. There, on the carpet, was a trail of wet mud, leading from the front door, leading to Jessica's room. Susan opened the door. The room was empty, but on the window pane, written in condensation, were two words: "We are hungry." Susan locked the door and never opened it again. But sometimes, on stormy nights, when the wind blows from the south, she hears a girl laughing, and she knows that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. The bayou was far away, but the water finds a way.